Let's break down every single wide receiver, running back, tight end, and quarterback that you could possibly add last minute off of the waiver wire to help you bring home a dub heading into week 12 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Let's start the video with Quentin Johnston of the LA Chargers, a player that, we talked about in the early waiver video here on the channel, and I think a lot of channels out there are probably talking about, and a player that as the week has progressed, I really like going into this week 12 matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, a team that has really struggled against the wide receiver position, still giving up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in all of the league. And Johnston is at 64% rostered, so I mean a high roster percentage, but still at the point where you may have a chance in your respective league to go out and grab Quentin Johnston and play him this week. He's a strong flex option here in the Biocalypse. He's a player due to injuries that you can easily plug in this week, and a player who has 10.4 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts, a touchdown in each of his last 3 starts. He gets another great matchup in week 13 against the Atlanta Falcons, a great matchup in week 15 to kick off the fantasy playoffs against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This Chargers offense throwing the football a lot right now. They look great throwing the football, and Quentin Johnston has been a big part of that next to Ladd McConkey and Will Dissly at the tight end position. So if QJ's out there and available, he's my favorite add at the wide receiver position heading into week 12. And I love Quentin Johnston's total fantasy points line on Underdog this week, sitting at 9.25 total fantasy points. He has hit that in each of his last 3 games, and he scored a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. And this is the best matchup Quentin Johnston has had all season long. I would be hitting straight to Underdog to take the over on Johnston's total fantasy points. If you don't know, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 12's action. That link is down below. Once you claim your free Pick Em, take this line for Johnston, and once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And as long as you sign up on Underdog with that link down below and with promo code THECATCH, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Next up, let's talk about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, a player that we've talked about on the channel for a couple weeks now. And I mean, I think people are still scared to go out and add him. He sits at 19% rostered. But once again, if you're struggling here at the end of the week due to bye weeks and injuries and everything, he gets a great matchup going up against the Houston Texans, a team that's allowed a lot of fantasy points to the wide receiver position on the season. They got a good front 7. They're good against the run. They don't have a very good secondary. Even the Cowboys snuck some plays in against them this past week. But looking at Westbrook-Ikhine, he has a touchdown in every game except for 1 since week 6. He has double digits in 3 of his last 4 games. And Will Levis, for what it's worth, has been, well, at least better by Will Levis standards in his past 2 starts, and been at least been able to find ways to get the football to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine and Calvin Ridley for the most part as well. So it's a good matchup here. If you're desperate, this is a player that you can run to the waiver wire and add and at least cross your fingers. I know you look back to last week, he only had 2 catches, and one of them was the big 98-yard touchdown grab where he was left just wide open against Minnesota. You take that away, there's really nothing last week, but we can't take it away. It happens. So, listen, it's not my most confident play, but the numbers back it up. A touchdown or double digits in every game since week 6, except for that week 10 matchup against the Chargers. So, if you're desperate for a wide receiver play, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine may just be your guy here in week 12. Next up is Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants, coming in at 62% rostered. And I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten about Robinson because in his last 4 starts, things were pretty shaky. Just double digits once in 4 games there. But 3 of those that were not double digits came in tough matchups against the Eagles, the Steelers, and the Commanders. And he was okay against the Carolina Panthers. And then he had the bye week in week 11. And then a lot of people don't really want to pick him up or start him this week because, well, Tommy DeVito is now the starting quarterback for the Giants. And that has made people lose all faith in these Giants wide receivers and this Giants offense. But mean, can it be that much worse than Daniel Jones? I know some people are going to say yes, but Tommy DeVito put together some decent games last year, got double-digit performances out of different wide receivers like Darius Slayton, like Jalen Hyatt, and like Rondell Robinson. So if he's out there and available, I think he's worth a shot if you're desperate for a flex play, because facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, a team allowing some of the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. A theme here with these first couple players, they all are going up against extremely soft secondaries in week 12. We've talked about starting quarterbacks and wide receivers against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers all season long. This defense has been struggling mightily in the secondary. So I think Robinson can piece together a nice outing. I'm not expecting a super high ceiling here, but I think around 10 fantasy points is doable for Robinson here in week 12. So if you're in desperate need of a flex play and he's still out there and available, I think he's worth a shot. And if he's sitting on your bench right now and you're in a tough spot, I think he is startable here in week 12. Next up is Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts, coming in at 26% rostered. And this is a player that's definitely a bit of a gamble, but trying to have a nice mix in today's video of players a little bit higher rostered and players lower rostered. And he comes in at 26% rostered, but he has 10 or more fantasy points in his last two starts. And we date back to some of his better starts on the season, weeks 1 and 2, where he had 16 or more fantasy points, 21.5 in week 1. Those were games with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. So I think that he has a nice little chemistry with Anthony Richardson. We did see, a couple of good performances out of him with Joe Flacco at the helm, but nonetheless, double digits in his last two games and a good matchup this week against the Detroit Lions, still giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So it's a good matchup. A little bit of life sprinkled into this Colts offense. He's been good the past 2 weeks, a good performance against the Buffalo Bills in week 10 with 18.1 fantasy points. So I know a lot of people looking maybe to Michael Pittman this week to improve on last week. Josh Downs, an obvious start at the position. But then who's the next man up? A.D. Mitchell, Ashton Dolan? No, it's Alec Pierce. And if you're desperate for a wide receiver play, desperate for a flex play, he sits at just 26% roster. I think he's a startable player at the position here in week 12. So let's take a look at Adam Thielen. We talked about him in last week's video, and he is still not deemed fully healthy, still going into week 12 as questionable. And, I don't love the matchup this week going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. I think he's startable in this matchup, but coming off of the injury, hasn't played since week 3. Bad matchup. Tough to really say what we would potentially get out of Thielen in week 12 is if he is good to go. If you're desperate, I think he has some flex appeal this week. But the main reason I want to take a look at Adam Thielen is because he plays Tampa Bay in week 13. He plays Tampa Bay again in week 17. Then he also sneaked Dallas in there. And then a tough matchup against Philly, tough matchup against Arizona. But some of these matchups, we want to start to look a little bit further down the stretch against, especially if you're moving into the fantasy playoffs. So even if we're just looking at week 13, gets Tampa Bay. Great matchup. Maybe that's his first game back. Maybe this is his first game back, but he's not 100%, good to go. Doesn't get fully acclimated into the offense. I think against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he definitely can. So just don't forget, right, Adam Thielen, Bryce Young, good chemistry last year. Thielen was a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy last year. And while I'm not expecting that to fully come to life this year, he could definitely have some nice games in those softer matchups. So for me, if you're picking up Thielen, I think you maybe hold off this week unless you're extremely desperate, but he could be a good stash moving forward and a good spot play based on matchup. All right, and very quickly, a couple other wide receiver rooms that we can take a quick look at. We can, of course, take a look at Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. Dobbs sits at 64% rostered. Watson sits at 60% rostered. Should get a good game script against the Niners at home for the Packers, but we know the volatility with these Packers receivers. They, of course, are players you can always plug in, but you don't know if Dobbs is going to go for 2.7 points or Watson's going to go for 19 or vice versa or when it's going to happen. But they always offer some nice upside going into each and every week. And then we did see plenty of production out of the Broncos wide receivers, Devon Vele, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, everybody last week. at the wide receiver position, except for Cortland Sutton, scored a touchdown, and Vele's been the most consistent over the past couple weeks. But it is a tough matchup this week against the Raiders. Believe it or not, they've been pretty good against wide receivers all season long. But if you're desperate, one of those guys may end up being an option. All right, let's move along to the running back position. Let's take a look at Jaylen Warren. I know for a lot of you guys, it's going to be difficult to pick him up because he already played, right? The Steelers played the Browns in that tough loss in the snow. Great game. Jameis Winston, maybe not a great fantasy start. Encourage you guys to bench him, but great game by Jameis Winston. A lot of fun in that game on both sides. Nonetheless, Jaylen Warren had 15.4 fantasy points, 45 yards on the ground, a touchdown, which was his first touchdown on the season, 5 targets, 3 catches, 19 receiving yards, and looked good. Najee Harris still owned the backfield. He had 5 more touches than Jaylen Warren, but ultimately, Jaylen Warren was much more efficient, right? 4.09 yards per carry, Najee 2.56 yards per carry. And it's a little bit tough to kind of hop on the handcuff train here as he is sitting at 62% rostered, but he now has 9.5 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games and in tough matchups, Washington, Baltimore, and Cleveland. And to be fair, I mean, the schedule doesn't get much better. Cincinnati, Cleveland, Philly, Baltimore, Kansas City. So I think we could continue to see more involvement out of Jaylen Warren in these tough matchups. You are kind of crossing your fingers he gets enough receptions or he stumbles into the end zone that it takes you over that double-digit mark. But he looked good on Thursday Night Football. I know it's kind of a weird game script, the snow and everything. But if you are able to add him before the coming waiver period and before Sunday, I say go ahead and pick him up, stash him for now, and we'll see what happens in these next couple of matchups. Next up is Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals. So we look at this one, right, and obviously he is a handcuff situation, but 8 or more touches on the ground in the last 2 starts and at least 1 catch in his last 2 starts, 10.7 fantasy points or more in his last 2 starts. So 2 straight games with double-digit performances before the bye week last week in week 11 for Trey Benson. So this is obviously still James Conner's backfield, but he's a strong handcuff to pick up as we start to wrap up the season. We know Conner is age 29. He's found a way to stay healthy season after season. Don't get me wrong. No disrespect to James Conner. He's been fantastic this season. But if something does happen there, we know that this offense has had plenty of game plans this year where they've ran the football first and foremost. So Trey Benson would be walking into a lot of volume. I know Mari DeMarcado would end up probably with some of that volume, but I think Benson would still be the lead back here. And if we're looking at a handcuff running back that gives us the best chance for standalone value this week, it's probably Trey Benson in a good matchup against the Seattle Seahawks with 2 straight games with double-digit fantasy points. Could be wrong on this one. We'll see what happens. I know he scored the touchdown in week 9. And he got some extra volume in week 10 because the Cardinals were stomping the Jets. But I think he's worth the risk here if we're looking for a desperation play at the running back position. And very quickly, you guys can take a look at the screen and see some of the roster percentages for handcuff running backs going in to week 12. Plenty of names here. It's not a full list, but I would say outside of Benson and Warren, these are the next best handcuffs you guys can pick up as we start to wrap up the fantasy season. I will say Ray Davis is probably my favorite on this list, but there's plenty of good options here. Tyler Algier, Justice Hill, Emmanuel Wilson, Jordan Mason, Braylon Allen, Cam Akers, Blake Corum, Roshan Johnson, and Zach Charbonnet. Plenty of value across the board here. If you're looking to handcuff your RB1, or if you're just looking to pick up a handcuff who may help you down the stretch, these are the guys that we want to take a look out outside of Jaylen Warren and Trey Benson moving into week 12. Then I will mention very quickly here, we do have the Raiders running back situation going on here. It looks like Amir Abdullah will move into week 12 as the lead back, as Alexander Madison is doubtful for week 12, and Zamir White has been ruled doubtful as well, as we expected going into the week. We talked about this in the early waiver video. Dylan Lobb, it could be an option as well. He sits at 4% rostered, but looks like Abdullah is going to get the bulk of the carries and volume here. He did have 10 fantasy points in week 11 against the Dolphins, scoring a receiving touchdown. Didn't do really anything else, but it's a bad matchup. Gets Denver, then he gets Kansas City the following week if he does see volume in week 13 before got a good remainder of the season schedule there, maybe outside of Atlanta. But overall here, this is still a desperation play for me due to the matchup. Amir Abdullah has moved up to 10% rostered, but this is a true desperation play. Would only get into this one if you absolutely have no better options here in week 12. Let's move along to the tight end position. And just a reminder, if you guys missed yesterday's video, we did go over the top streaming options at quarterback and tight end. And on that list included Will Dissly of the LA Chargers, sitting at 50% rostered, coming off of a 18-point fantasy day in week 11 against the Bengals. 6 targets, 4 grabs, 80 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Gets a smash matchup this week against the Baltimore Ravens, a team that have struggled mightily against the tight end position. Once again, we talked about this at the beginning of the video, but this Chargers team is humming. They're throwing the football a ton. Justin Herbert looks great. Their passing attack looks great. We get another nice primetime game at home for the Chargers this week. I think Will Dissly will be a big part of the game plan once again. It's a great matchup. There's really nothing to not like here. Be careful chasing points here. Don't get me wrong. He might not score 18 fantasy points, but I think double digits could easily happen this week for Will Dissly. He's my favorite streaming option at the tight end position here in week 12 and gets a couple good matchups moving forward: Atlanta, Kansas City, and Tampa Bay over the next couple weeks. Kansas City been very good against most positions in fantasy, but they've struggled against opposing tight ends. All those other matchups very good as well. So Will Dissly, if he's out there, could be a starting tight end over the next couple weeks and is a strong start here in week 12. All right, next up, let's take a look at Luke Schoonmaker of the Dallas Cowboys. Jake Ferguson has been ruled out for week 12 with a concussion. He's not playing. So that brings up the next man up. That's Luke Schoonmaker, who had 10 targets, 6 grabs, 56 receiving yards, and 11.6 fantasy points in week 11 against the Houston Texans. So Cooper Rush apparently views Schoonmaker as a pass catcher that he trusts, and it's not a fantastic matchup against the Washington Commanders, and I am worried about the Cowboys offense this week, but nonetheless, Schoonmaker came away at double digits in week 11. He's a low rostered player, sitting at 17% rostered. If you're struggling, you're desperate, you need somebody to plug in, Luke Schoonmaker could walk away with another high volume game in week 12 and end up being a player that helps get you through the week. The last tight end we're going to talk about is Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, sitting at 52% rostered, and he's just a player that I believe at the tight end position is a solid start moving forward. You're tight end 13 on the season, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 63 receiving yards, 12.3 fantasy points in week 11. A little bit of a stiffer matchup against the Miami Dolphins this week, but nonetheless, in every full game Drake May has played on the season, Henry has walked away with double digits except for week 10 against the Chicago Bears, one of the best teams against opposing tight ends in fantasy. And even in week 8, when Drake May had to leave the game, he still finished with 9.5 fantasy points, just under the double-digit mark. So not an incredibly high ceiling for Hunter Henry, but he's a player that you can count on to probably come through with a safe floor on a week in, week out basis. This is easily one of Drake May's favorite targets and probably the most consistent pass catcher on the Patriots team right now. So Henry, a strong start at tight end, who sits at 52% rostered moving into week 12. Another line that I really like on Underdog this week is Hunter Henry's total receptions line, sitting at 4.5 total receptions. He has hit that in 4 out of the last 5 games, and the only game he didn't hit it was in that tough matchup against the Chicago Bears, one of the best teams against tight ends in the league. So I absolutely love this line. He also has 6 or more targets in 4 of the last 5 games. So the volumes there, I'd be hitting straight to Underdog to take the over on Hunter Henry's total receptions. Like I said earlier, sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch. Get your free pick 'em for week 12. Pair your free pick 'em with Henry's total receptions. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Finish off with quarterbacks, and let's start with Anthony Richardson, who has moved up to 57% rostered. And it's not a fantastic matchup this week against the Detroit Lions. So I think for a lot of fantasy managers, this is kind of like a risk reward type situation. The Lions, giving up the sixth fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. And you got A-Rich coming off of this game where he had 28 fantasy points, 2 rushing touchdowns, 32 rushing yards, 20 of 30, 272 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. A little hard to really predict what we're going to get out of the Colts and Anthony Richardson this week specifically. They're at home. They're playing the best team in the NFL, I think many would argue, but this defense has had its moments where they've slipped up on the season. They've had moments where they've completely dominated teams, and they're very good against the run, so it's going to be interesting to see how they're able to or not able to limit Richardson on the ground. It's not like Richardson was fantastic on the ground last week. He just found a way to score 2 rushing touchdowns, right? He only had 3.2 yards per carry, but nonetheless, that still helps in fantasy when you have 32 rushing yards. So there's risk here, but if Richardson's out there, hey, I think he's worth a shot. You want to take some upside here, take some risk. I'm for it. It just depends on what other options you have at quarterback, but maybe a Brock Purdy's been ruled out kind of last minute here. Maybe this is one of your only options. Richardson gives you some upside as we get into week 12. Like I said, if you want to check out yesterday's video, we broke down some of the higher tier names at streaming options for quarterback, but I want to break down 2 quarterbacks who maybe aren't as high tier, let's just put it that way, but they're very low rostered, and we're in a rough week here. Like I'm in 2 super flex dynasty leagues, right, where I have Brock Purdy, and then I coincidentally have another quarterback on bye week. So I know, like, for those of you guys in double quarterback super flex leagues, it's a little rough right now with the bye weeks and injuries and everything. So Will Levis sits at 16% roster. He has 16.6 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. And he gets a good matchup this week against the Houston Texans. I think around 16, 17 fantasy points can certainly happen for Will Levis this week. I also think it could be a disaster because this is Will Levis we're talking about. But nonetheless, one other thing I will mention, especially for those of you in double quarterback, super flex formats, Will Levis has one of the best overall strength of schedules for the fantasy playoffs. Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville. And in week 14, he also plays Jacksonville. Really, the only bad matchup to wrap up the season for Will Levis is week 13 on the road against Washington. So if you're desperate enough, you need to play this week. It's a good matchup against the Houston Texans, and he has a favorable schedule for the remainder of the season. So don't get me wrong, I understand the risk with this one. I understand the quarterback we're talking about, but like I said, I want to include somebody a little bit lower rostered who wasn't on yesterday's video who could surprise you. And for me in week 12, that's Will Levis. I didn't talk about him in yesterday's video, but let's wrap up today's video with Tommy DeVito. Just want to remind you guys, it's a great matchup this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They are one of the worst teams against opposing quarterbacks in fantasy, one of the worst teams against the wide receiver position in fantasy, and they have fallen back against running backs as well. It's a home game for the Giants here. We still got some offensive pieces here. We still got Malik Neighbors. Robinson hasn't been that bad on the season. Darius Slayton's had moments on the season. Tyrone Tracy looks great at the tight end position, or excuse me, the running back position, and at the tight end position, Theo Johnson's had some nice games over the past couple of weeks. So there are weapons for DeVito here. It is a great matchup, and DeVito did some things last year. He did have a 22.5 performance against Washington, one of the worst defenses in the league last year. He had 17.4 fantasy points against Green Bay in week 14, and he did put together good enough games that wide receivers did benefit last year. But looking at DeVito, this is a true desperation play. Going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, this is one of the best teams to start quarterbacks against in all of fantasy football. Once again, for those of you in double quarterback, super flex formats who are absolutely desperate, this is a play here in week 12. Call me crazy. Now, obviously, you want to check, Matthew Stafford, Tua Tagovailoa, Drake May, Anthony Richardson. There are other names that you can potentially pick up off the waiver wire that can help get you through the week. But if you're in a desperate spot, we can take a look at players like Will Levis and Tommy DeVito here in the Biocalypse, Week 12. That'll do it for today's video. There are all of your last-minute waiver wire ads moving into Week 12 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, like always, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. I will be sure to clear all comments before Sunday's slate of games. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. And as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below because we have everything on a week in, week out basis to help you guys dominate 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you guys are checking out all of the content here on the channel, but more importantly, make sure you guys subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.